people that were interested but had class at this time. So I'd like to be able to share this with the lecture. So with that, let's get started. Welcome everybody to this today's session with Professor Ben Lee, Computing Cultural Heritage Towards Search and Discovery at Scale. And this event is hosted by the Center for Advances in Libraries, Museums, and Archives, and it's part of our fledgling Research and Practice series. CALMA, which I hope you're starting to hear about. So we have a purpose to build and strengthen connections among those at the iSchool, across UW libraries, and in our professional communities who are advancing research and scholarship for libraries, museums, and archives. So you see, even though we have a presenter who's joining us by Zoom, we thought it was great to take opportunity to have people come in person and meet new colleagues at the same time. So hope as we build this community together, we'll be studying the diverse systems of knowledge, their production, collection, and access, and with that, amplifying libraries, archives, and museums' critical roles in fostering thriving communities and elevating stories of our humanity. We are targeting a launch, we are on track, and we'll be having a formal launch this fall in the new academic year, but that didn't stop us from getting some programming started in this earlier this calendar year. I have had the privilege of working with a wonderful task force whose names are listed here. I want to thank them for all of their energy and advice and consultation along the way. And also David, who's in the room, David Stram, our wonderful graduate research assistant, who's been just joined right in and has been invaluable. So with that, I'm going to stop the slideshow and introduce Benjamin Charles Germain Lee. I love a person with two middle names like myself. So Ben is an incoming assistant professor in the information school here at UW. He's currently a Kluge Fellow in Digital Studies at the Library of Congress. Ben received his PhD in computer science and engineering here at the university, and that was supported by a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship in Machine Learning. He also served as the inaugural Digital Humanities Associate Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, as well as a visiting fellow in Harvard's History Department. Ben also served as a 2020 Innovator in Residence at the Library of Congress and the 2021 Richard and Ina Wilner Memorial Fellow in the Strom Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Washington. So welcome, Ben, and I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much for the introduction, Sharon. It's great to be in a UW audience here. I apologize for being in Zoom. I think one of the challenges of being in Washington, D.C. is nobody ever knows which Washington I'm in, but we're working on it. But with that, let me go ahead and share my slide deck here. Let me know if you have any trouble hearing me or seeing the slide deck or anything like that. So I'm really excited to be here in particular around CALMA, and it's been really great to hear about the launch and what's in store. And hopefully this talk will be sort of relevant in the context of libraries, museums, archives, and sort of while I'm maybe instead of taking an approach of looking at one very particular project, I'm instead going to try to talk about or situate this idea of computing cultural heritage that I see emerging in this work. It's sort of the interdisciplinary intersection of computer science, information science, and LAMS. And with that, I think the sort of general outline that I'll take is both trying to introduce this notion, then drilling down to a couple of projects that I've been working on. The first being Newspaper Navigator, which I started back in 2019 through my dissertation research and continue to work on, and sort of moving toward the present, including extensions of that work, but then also looking at web archives, switching from sort of digitized context to a more born digital context, and questioning sort of notions of search and discovery at scale. And with that, I'll zoom back out toward a horizon of work in computing cultural heritage. And then lastly, leave us with time for questions. So I'm going to try to hold myself to, no more than 40 minutes here or so to leave us with ample time for questions, which I think I'm particularly looking forward to. I'm going to start by situating this work through a recurring thing that I've heard here at the Library of Congress, where I'm currently situated for the year and also giving this talk today. And this idea, the sort of persistent notion of the Library of Congress as a unit of measurement that seems to show up all over the place. Leslie Johnston has written a number of really interesting blog posts for the library discussing places where people use the Library of Congress as a unit of measurement. And I find this to be really interesting because I think from a number of perspectives, in terms of what it means to treat Library of Congress or cultural heritage as the sort of notion of data or data measurement, and what that actually reduces in many senses or elides. And reading some of these quotes, every 6 hours the NSA gathers as much data as is stored into the entire Library of Congress. Facebook's photo collection is over X times larger than the Library of Congress. And there are a couple of things that immediately come to mind. The first is this idea that the Library of Congress as a unit of measurement is dictated by sort of plain text of all of the books in the institution compressed down, as of order tens of terabytes, which of course completely misses the fact that we have audiovisual materials here on site. There are all sorts of web archives at the petabyte scale and beyond. But I also think it raises a lot of really interesting provocations about how we treat data and how we compare it. The notion that the data exhaust in some of these, Facebook clicks being related to, the kinds of cultural heritage being stored at the Library of Congress or other kinds of archives at all levels, I think is a really interesting one. And also, I would say, even this very notion of the unit of data as in terms of bytes as being the most relevant way of measuring also has its own sort of fraud implications, right? One could imagine taking a scan of a newspaper page, upping the resolution, to extraordinary amounts just to claim that one has more data. And at what point does more data actually mean more sort of relevance in terms of what is useful for members of communities? And so I say all of that just to sort of launch into this sort of notion of scale in the archive, and both in terms of a technical challenge, but also in terms of a broader socio-technical one. And so, my work at the Library of Congress has largely been in the context of, newspapers or in web archives. And so on the left, I'm showing a photo of the serials division here in the Madison building, which shows these stacks of newspaper pages that are in the process of being digitized. And this is really a very small drop in the bucket. The initiative called Chronicling America that the Library of Congress started in partnership with the NEH and state and territorial level partners has been really remarkably successful over the years, but has taken decades of work to get to the point of now over 20 million pages. Here I will quote the actual sort of size just to give one sense of scale. Again, not suggesting that this notion of 100 terabytes is the be all and end all or the way we should be thinking about it, but rather to frame it computationally in terms of what we might be encountering when we begin to apply computational methodologies. If we look toward the digital context, a born digital context in particular, on the World Wide Web, we know that, say, the Internet Archive, the Library of Congress, Common Crawl, and beyond have archives at the petabyte scale with billions of web page snapshots. And so, of course, there is this sort of central question of how we begin to compute against this, both for search and discovery, for questions in digital humanities and cultural analytics, library and information science, and beyond. But I'd argue that this really isn't just purely a question of how we compute against these collections. It's really a much deeper one in terms of the archive, its unevenness, its silences, and beyond. And one example of this is OCR, or optical character recognition, that many of us are familiar with. Given a scanned document, we have a task that basically transcribes the letters on the page. And so here I'm showing 4 photos reproducing the same photo of W.E.B. Du Bois from Black newspapers in Chronicling America. And so we see the text, or the actual text on the image says W.E.B. Du Bois, comma, PhD. And if we look at the transcriptions from OCR of each of these 4 reproductions, we see that not only are each of the 4 incorrect, the actual mistranscription occurring in each image varies image to image. And this of course means that if we try to do with fuzzy matching, we can sort of remediate this to a certain degree. But by and large, if you were to do a literal string matching, we'd lose all 4 of these photos. And it's really not just a question of these kinds of isolated mistranscriptions, but of course extends to all sorts of questions around entire languages that are being missed. In natural language processing, there's this idea of low resource languages. We know that there are indigenous languages like Ladino, that are effectively un-OCRable, or OCR performs really poorly at the moment. And what this means is that there are entire archives here that even if one has the ability to scan the pages and do digitization in that sense, it's really difficult to be able to provide useful transcriptions that unlock keyword search, make the collections available for large-scale analysis in ways that go beyond close reading. And so that's where I'd say my work is situated in this question of how we explore, make sense of, and analyze these collections at scale, but really not just thinking through it from a computational perspective. And I really like this idea of computing cultural heritage, which is a phrase that has sort of occurred in a number of different contexts here over the years. And I see my work sort of situated in this space, and this idea of computing cultural heritage to be a rich one, sort of for libraries, archives, and museums, in the sense that, in my mind at least, it really tries to foreground the collections themselves and doing work to aid in their discoverability. And so with my work, I sort of have three approaches that I see as the significant ones, but also that I think I see as the important ones for this more broader body of work that, of course, many of you are thinking about, and more broadly in the community are thinking about when we ask questions around computation and the materials held in these digital collections. So the first is that I develop, deploy, and evaluate these kinds of larger scale search and discovery systems using machine learning. And the second is, on top of this, I try to use these systems then to advance research in the digital humanities through collaboration. And one of the great joys of this work is being able to collaborate with humanists and librarians and other people with extraordinary disciplinary context to be able to come together to answer questions that I, of course, would have no hope of answering on my own. And lastly, really trying to foreground these kinds of ethical and socio-technical implications of the work. Here, thinking about questions of marginalization and erasure as they manifest in the digital archive. So, of course, my academic home here will be the iSchool at UW, which I'm incredibly excited about, and see this as a great opportunity to start the work of working with you all. Um, as Sharon mentioned in my bio, I've been fortunate to be embedded in a couple of cultural heritage institutions doing work with the digital collections directly, whether at the Library of Congress or the Holocaust Museum. And in that sense, I see the work sort of as interfacing between the on-the-ground questions that are emerging with digital collections and what we might see in a more sort of academic context around AI research, digital humanities research, and beyond, and trying to navigate between those two spaces. My work in this space, and maybe I'll turn almost sort of autoethnographically or self-reflective here for a moment to speak about my own orientation toward this work. My first exposure to this work was during my time really finishing up college and then into working at the Holocaust Museum, where I was thinking about questions surrounding what's called the International Tracing Service Archive, which is one of the world's largest archives of material pertaining to victims of the Holocaust. And my first exposure to this archive actually wasn't when, in my 20s, but actually as a teenager with my grandmother who survived Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, visiting the Holocaust Museum and speaking with staff, processing requests in this specific archive related to my grandmother and our family members. And so returning many years later from this sort of computational side of asking how we might begin to improve the metadata in this collection, I think has really been an important lens for my work, both as someone who sees the sort of computational challenges of doing this and enriching metadata, improving access, and thinking about how people encounter the archive, but also understanding what it means to be someone whose family is represented within the archive, being sensitive to these questions of datafication, erasure, and who owns the underlying data as well, as one that I try to carry forth in my work, even if I'm not on both sides in all cases. So I'm going to spend probably 10 minutes here talking about my project Newspaper Navigator that I began now back in 2019 during my PhD here at the Allen School at UW, and also working really closely with the labs team at the Library of Congress through their Innovator in Residence program. And Newspaper Navigator is built on Chronicling America, that collection that I had mentioned, which now has over 20 million newspaper pages from across the US. They're all in the public domain. And also the collection supports full API and bulk data access. And I highlight that because it's really, I think in my mind, a really exemplary case of how making the data available makes it possible to really think about these questions in new ways. But one of the other really exciting things about Chronicling America, in my mind, is just the diverse communities that interact with the collection. So here we have scholars, of course, from all sorts of different disciplines who use Chronicling America on a regular basis, but also teachers and students in the classroom using the newspaper pages as primary source material, journalists, genealogists for people doing research on family or local history, and even members of the public who are curious in stepping back in time and exploring our collective cultural heritage. If you visit the Chronicling America portal, you'll find front pages like the ones shown here, and these are high-resolution JP2s of front pages from from 100 years ago that also have underlying text transcriptions from that OCR that allow us to do keyword search across the corpus. So instead of just being restricted to sort of metadata facets like newspaper title or date of publication, we can actually do some content-based retrieval. And so if you punch in keywords, they'll retrieve pages and highlight them on the page with these localized sort of bounding boxes. And of course, this really unlocks the collection. I'm sure all of us have had experiences using collections that have underlying OCR transcriptions and just how much it changes our ability to encounter the materials. And the question that I became interested in through this crowdsourcing initiative that the Library of Congress launched back in 2017 called Beyond Words was trying to orient ourselves actually toward the visual culture in in chronicling America, recognizing that text is, of course, incredibly valuable, but visual culture has a whole other set of challenges. And so in this crowdsourcing initiative, volunteers were asked to draw bounding boxes around 5 different types of visual content. Here, this was photos, illustrations, maps, comics, cartoons. They're asked to note down the artists and categories. But really, I think most importantly in my mind was that it was really successful. It accrued thousands of verified annotations and tens of thousands of unverified ones, and engaged people across the country in various capacities and age groups and beyond. And so when I saw this crowdsourcing initiative when it was launched, I think it really changed my own understanding of newspapers as really textual sources to recognizing just how rich the visual culture was. And so here's a small sampling of some of the visual culture identified by volunteers. Excuse me. And when the Library of Congress launched or released their call for concept papers to work with their digital collections, my mind really returned to this, not just because I found it so interesting, but also because if they had these thousands of annotations, maybe there was a source of training data here or fine-tuning data for a machine learning model to try to extract this visual culture and then across the collection and then reimagine how we search over it. And so I like the Library of Congress's digital strategy, which has this idea of throwing open the treasure chest. And so the question that I really wanted to ask was, how can we do this in the context of the visual materials? And so the project, as it ended up unfolding over the course of the work, was to start with the newspaper pages themselves, create the newspaper navigator data set of extracted visual culture and headlines, then create a search application to build out new ways of searching over the materials, not just over the captions, but also really trying to think through new modes of interaction, here a visual search and visual similarity toward this idea that my advisor Dan Weld and I sort of called open faceted search. But then putting this in front of real people, launching it with the Library of Congress, and using these kinds of interaction patterns to understand how these new modes of searching might be beneficial, and also to understand these kinds of use cases through vignettes and other kinds of feedback as well. And I'll speak to a few of those in a moment. Just really briefly, high level about the data set, and I should preface all of this by saying that I'm just going fast in the interest of time, but am of course more than happy to talk about any of this at length. With the data set, the idea was we could take an object detection model like the one shown on the left, which is of course this task of given an image, drawing bounding boxes localized on the image plane of, say, a dog or a bicycle or a truck, and fine-tuning it or training it some more on those beyond words annotations to then predict where, say, bounding boxes or where advertisements or newspaper ad cartoons are appearing on the page. And so there is this sort of natural resonance, as you can see, between that task on the left and the one on the right. And that's what we're trying to do when we fine-tune object detection model on the sort of task-specific data. And so, once we train this model, the idea was building out a pipeline to then extract the visual content. And so the idea for a given image was we could run the visual content recognition, crop and save out all the content, also go into the underlying OCR and grab all the text falling within each bounding box, and treating that as a form of caption for the visual content, generating some image embeddings to do visual similarity, and then saving this. And so here, this is a closed loop for one page. And so then we were able to scale it up to, at the time, all 16 million pages in the collection. I'm going to skip over some summary statistics and just offer one sort of anecdote about why this might be useful. So the Library of Congress offers these what they call topic pages through Teaching with Primary Sources initiative, where students in the classroom can access various lock.gov materials and see events or people in American history and click through to read about them, and then also be directed to pages in Chronicling America or articles more particularly discussing that event or that person or showing different viewpoints. And one of the persistent challenges that staff had was how to produce, say, a representative map, the set of maps of the Civil War. As one can imagine, ordinarily this would require going through tens of thousands of pages, sort of manually sifting through and cropping them out. But with the Newspaper Navigator data set, we can instead do a simple query, ask for all the maps from 1861 to 1865, and here's a quick sort of visualization of what we get back. And if we zoom in, we'll see that these are all pretty much maps of the Civil War. You might notice that some of these are appearing many times, like the one I'm showing you here in red. And that's not because they're being identified redundantly. They're actually appearing in many different newspaper titles across time. And so here we see patterns of circulation emerging and all sorts of digital humanities kinds of questions that, say from Wonderful Viral Text Project by David Smith and Ryan Cordell might begin to translate onto visual culture as well. I'm going to gloss over just sort of access points, but the full data set's still hosted at news-navigator.labs.loc.gov, where we have multiple modes of access, including sort of computing against it using HTTPS or S3 requests. And we also have hundreds of what we call prepackaged data sets that allow you to download image sets without any coding necessary. And so, yeah, on the GitHub repo, we have info on the project, pointer to the paper we put out on this. But all of this is in the public domain from the data set to the underlying code. And I think, per the goal of really trying to facilitate this work with LAMS proper, making the code available has been an interesting way to facilitate other institutions embarking on work in similar, with similar collections. And so I see that sort of reciprocal exchange of code bases and fine-tuned models and even data sets as a really important direction for this kind of work in computing cultural heritage, and can certainly unpack what I mean by that in a bit more detail. With the search application, the question then became, once we have all this visual content, you can download it in zip files, but how can you actually search over it in a meaningful way? And so the search application is an interface for about 1.5 million photos from the data set. These are all the photos identified with high confidence from 1900 onward. And the idea here is to really try to expose the machine learning training to the end users, in addition to doing keyword search to allow them to train what we call AI navigators to retrieve visually similar content. I'll skip over some of these details, but the idea here is that in a screenshot I'll show in a second, it's an interactive interface where a user can begin to define these queries in a responsive way and train a machine learning model on the fly. The entry point to the collection is keyword search over those captions. And so here's a search of baseball, which gives back about 5,400 results. And you see it's pretty heterogeneous. We have few kinds of team shots or portrait shots or action shots of players. But then also, if you go to the Train My AI Navigators tab, it'll surface this interactive machine learning interface where a user can sort of progressively define positive or negative examples against the ones that are being returned on the right-hand side. This is all being done purely based on the visual features. None of the underlying text or captions are being used as a way of then retrieving images who are related to baseball but might not have the word baseball or anything relevant in their captions. Of course, captions, as great as they are, suffer from imperfections in OCR in terms of what's being described, whether, how literal or abstract it is, and beyond. In the interest of time, I'll just talk really briefly about some modes of impact we've seen in terms of how people have interacted with it. We still have, slightly under 1,000 active unique visitors to the site. For the data set, we've had millions of computational queries. We've also supported thousands of downloads of these prepackaged data sets. Anecdotally, these are students in the classroom and other contexts. For the search application, we've supported now over 40,000 unique sessions that have performed at least one keyword search, and have also had hundreds of these sessions train those kinds of AI navigators as well. But I do want to point to some of the vignettes or other interesting use cases that we've seen because I think they speak to ways that the project has sort of expanded or reached audiences that I hadn't quite expected with the project. The first one has been students in the classroom, and so I was really fortunate to be able to work with Eileen and Michael Burson, who are professors of education, to look through uses of machine learning in general, but of course, Newspaper Navigator in particular in the social studies classroom. And we've had educators sort of walk through how they use it in the classroom. Tom Bober, in his podcast, The Primary Source, takes an educator's view on walking through how the search application could be used in this context. We've also had, interestingly, in a way that I think surprised me, not just sort of humanities-oriented students or disciplines in social studies or English, but also computer science teachers using it in the classroom as a way of teaching generally about AI. Also, students in STEM classes have encountered it as a way of sort of developing media literacy, of understanding photos and the like. We've also had genealogists use the search application, which has been meaningful for me given my sort of path toward this kind of work. And people have found photos of ancestors and photos of their hometowns and things as well, which has been fun. I do want to take a minute here and turn toward maybe the more sort of critical approaches here toward this work, because it really became apparent to us, I'm going to say us, I mean labs, and Dan and myself, as we were launching the search application, recognizing how important it was to document the project, not just sort of from a technical perspective of, how many GPUs we use to train something or anything like that, but also really trying to be self-reflective in terms of all these kinds of human decisions that were being made that then mediate the end user's experience of encountering these materials. And so to do this, I ended up studying these 4 pages of newspapers from Chronicling America, all of which are reproducing the same article describing the launch of the crisis, the official publication of the NAACP, and all of which feature this photo of W.E.B. Du Bois that I had shown earlier. And before we even get to any sort of machine learning and we just look at the sort of materiality of the page and the digitization pipeline through microfilm, we see how profoundly different the images look. The one on the left is effectively entirely saturated. Linus Williams has some fantastic work in computational archival science, or sorry, yes, computational archival science, describing this kind of way that microfilming can be its own form of erasure for people of darker skin tones. And so I definitely recommend checking that work out. But also not just thinking through the kinds of ink patterns or microfilm settings, but also the ways in which one's choice on a cut and confidence score coming back from a model really has a drastic impact on what's included or excluded in the data set. So here we see a permissive cut of 5% all the way to a really stringent cut of 90% and how it impacts the underlying data set. We also see, as I mentioned, the OCR, of course, being imperfect. And if we use the technique that I've shown in the search application of using all the text falling within each bounding box, we see that this problem's redoubled. On the right-hand side, these images from the broadax virtually have no usable text underlying them. If we then instead turn to sort of visual similarity as a mode of retrieval, here I'm showing 1,000 random images. These are ResNet embeddings for these 4 of the 1,000 photos. We see that 3 of the photos of Du Bois are clustered together. One's not. It's that photo that's really saturated again. And so I think it's a reminder that no matter how we go about remediating these questions of access, whether through image or visual features or textual features, we encounter these ways in which there are necessarily imperfections. And so in this piece, I try to really excavate them and document these specific kinds of ways in which they manifest in the project. And so I see this as sort of an important part of the work that is, sorry, I advanced too quickly there. Yeah, I think incorporating this kind of reflection on one's work in a sort of more critical way. I'll speak about this in a second, where I see a lot of this work occurring across libraries, archives, and museums. But before I do that, I do just want to briefly mention some of the other ways that this kind of work with newspapers has allowed me to really have exposure to all sorts of different kinds of disciplinary orientations toward newspapers through print scholarship, questions in Jewish studies and beyond. And so I've been really fortunate over the past many years to be working with Jim Casey, Sarah Salter, and Joshua Ortiz-Baco surrounding newspaper pages of ethnic periodicals, and in particular asking with Newspaper Navigator how the kinds of visual layouts that are being detected can be used as a way of uncovering editorship practices that are being sort of submerged when people's names weren't actually listed as editors on the pages. So we've uncovered sort of different kinds of periodicals from different communities that seem to have very, very similar kinds of visual grammars to their front pages. And I've also done some work towards more experimental bibliographies of newspapers as well. And on the right-hand side, I've been really fortunate to work with the Strom Center here on campus surrounding their collection of their Sephardic studies initiatives toward their Ladino library of materials, in particular their newspapers, in terms of how we might begin to search over them visually in the absence of usable OCR. But I mentioned that a lot of the sort of critical work here is, I think, a theme that I've seen across various institutions undertaking work in libraries and archives and museums. And so I can point to examples like Thomas Padilla's responsible operations work And then, of course, in the machine learning space, the emergence of sort of checklist literature, algorithmic impact assessments, and beyond. And recognizing that this work is sort of situated squarely in between the two, I wrote what I call the collections as ML data checklist for work in the space, trying to articulate some of the challenges and questions that emerge when applying machine learning to collections. Should we be doing this in the first place? What are the kinds of risks that we see involved? How does one maintain a project like this and document it properly? And so again, I think it's been really exciting to see others sort of document this as well in this space. And I think it's a really good sign as we move forward, doing this work in the context of cultural heritage institutions about how we can do it properly and thoughtfully and document this in a way where we can all learn from each other in communities. With that, I'm going to, in the interest of time, turn to, let's see how I'm doing. Okay, perfect. I will spend 10 minutes here and then wrap up towards some of my ongoing work that I've been starting here at the library surrounding web archives and born digital materials. And so I'm going to talk about this initially from the perspective of the importance of web archives across disciplines, just purely because I think the web archive has sort of become ubiquitous in many senses. For historians, I really like Ian Milligan's book, History in the Age of Abundance, which is fantastic, where he describes that our historical record is being and will be profoundly affected by the advent of these born digital repositories. And so here we think about post-1990s topics entering the domain of historical research and how this means that we have access to new questions, new subjects, and even new methodologies as we have to rely on web archives to do this kind of work. But it's not just history. And here I'm picking just two disciplines, but maybe from from having exposure in at the Allen School and everything as well, and following along as we see broader conversations around these large language models and everything too, recognizing just how central web archives are in this discussion as well. So we see these foundation models, to borrow language from Stanford, surrounding web archives or web derivatives. We have examples like Common Crawl, which we know that GPT is being trained on. The Yahoo Flickr Creative Commons 100 million data set, which is used for all sorts of vision training, the web image text data set, which Clip was trained on. And, I think this is something that many of us are exploring. But if you look at, say, the training table for GPT-3, this is all cultural heritage being used in one way or another, whether it's born digital materials or, transcriptions of books. But again, I would sort of offer a central provocation here, which is even though there are questions of opacity in terms of who has access to understanding what these things are being trained on, clearly it's essential that we have some understanding of web archives and how we can search over them if they're being used in this manner for training. One of the primary modes of access that I think we're all probably familiar with is, say, the Wayback Machine by the Internet Archive, where we can punch in a URL. Here I have cs.washington.edu, and we can look at what the departmental website looked like in 1996, which is fun. But I'd like to ask questions beyond how we just sort of look at the evolution of a specific web page snapshot of a URL over time, and instead ask how we might move toward navigating these web archives at scale in ways that are a bit different from just sort of standard keyword search or metadata faceting or URL lookup. And so the questions that I'm interested here are, can we build these kinds of open, flexible, and user-adaptable search systems for these petabyte scale web archives? How can these systems be used to collaboratively expand digital humanities and social science research? And lastly, how do we ensure ethical stewardship as we do this from a number of different lenses, marginalization, privacy, and labor? I've started this line of work a couple of years ago, working with Trevor Owens, who until very recently was here on site at the library and is now at the American Institute of Physics, thinking through what sort of initial sort of scalable pipelines might look like for born digital government publications, so i.e. PDFs coming from these web crawls. And so in this initial work, we build out sort of a baseline sort of scalable pipeline for looking at textual features, visual features, and metadata features from CDX files. But the question that I've been exploring this year is, where do we go and how can we expand this from, looking at of order 1,000 PDFs to millions or tens of millions of PDFs toward web archives of all sorts of heterogeneous materials? And so what I've been working with is the end of term web archive, which is available online, and it's created by the Library of Congress and a number of other host institutions, which every 4 years put together a crawl of various .gov, .mil, and other sites to effectively document the end of every presidential administration and have a lasting record This is significant from the perspective of understanding, of course, all sorts of questions around .gov materials, but also I think has been a really valuable use case because all of these .gov sites are public domain, meaning that it's a nice collection set to be able to work with from a copyright perspective too. In particular, I've been looking at the 2008 end of term web archive, which is about 15 terabytes and has about 4.5 million unique PDFs after hashing. Mark Phillips and Kathleen Murray have done some really great work around sort of analyzing the sort of PDF set more broadly, thinking from what subdomains they're coming from, the page distributions and everything too. But I do want to spend a little bit of time here sort of demoing what I find to be new ways of searching over these materials. And so with my current work, what I'm going to show you here is just a demo of how we might begin to search around a million .gov PDF pages. And these are the queries I'm going to be performing here are not specifically against the underlying text through keyword search or doing like a, analysis of different PDFs as they evolve on a specific URL or anything like that, but actually trying to allow us to do sort of natural language queries using clip embeddings. And I'm interested in this both from the perspective of end use, how we can give this to, say, a scholar in the archive, but also from the question of curation, how these kinds of tools might be useful for identifying document subcollections to facet off of, and how we can move beyond just the text search and metadata facets that are already there in the web archives. And so examples of these kinds of queries that we might begin to do are thinking about things like pie charts or redacted documents or schematics. And let me go ahead and show some examples here. So forgive me, this is just a notebook. So, still much to be done here on the UI side of things, but nonetheless, I can at least do this interactively. So I'll show a few examples here, but this is searching over about 1 million PDF pages, as I had mentioned before. And so now I'm doing sort of a natural language query for pie charts. And what this is going to go through is right now, if I should mention, it just takes a while to load the actual underlying images. The search itself is quite quick. But this is against the 1 million PDF pages. And what we find, of course, are, hundreds of pie charts that are appearing in these various .gov disclosure documents and such, largely ones produced via Excel or PowerPoint or the like, in the sort of canonical 3D pie chart format that we're all probably pretty accustomed to. And this is just one example that I like to offer because it's fun, but also I think it speaks to the way of searching that would not be embedded anywhere necessarily in the PDF text or the metadata that there's a pie chart appearing. Another sort of canonical example I see in this space is looking for redacted documents. And I offer this because in many senses, redacted documents, we can't identify just purely based on a text transcription because redaction is the act of removing text. And so in a sense, we need a multimodal approach to retrieve them because we know the kinds of black bars that appear that indicate some notion of redaction. And so here are, the top, I think 35 results that are coming back. Some of these examples are actually not truly redacted. Like a couple of these, I think, are just really bad scans that look like redaction, but nonetheless are valuable. And, in the interest of time here and getting to questions, I'd be more than happy to return to this and do some example queries that you all might be interested in. But again, I think these kinds of natural language queries sort of build on the kind of newspaper navigator style methods of search that I had mentioned. And again, I think is really perhaps exciting for me in terms of giving to archivists who are encountering these massive web archives and might just want to be able to isolate specific document sets and serve collections to end users in new ways. Returning to the slide deck here, I've also sort of gone from the largest of scales to thinking through the smallest of scales. And so Trevor and I have been working on a paper that we're about to submit looking at Powell.pps, perhaps the most infamous PowerPoint of all time, at the then Secretary of State, Colin Powell's presentation to the 2003 UN Security Council surrounding Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. And we picked this PDF this PowerPoint presentation, one, because it's so important from a media studies perspective and conveys a lot about how people view PowerPoints, but also because it's a really good case study to looking at the utility of these .gov domain web archives, where we can find copies of this PowerPoint being reproduced on all sorts of state.gov embassy level sites and can actually begin to understand how it's appearing across time on these different places. And so in tracing it, one of the more interesting things that we can do is not just sort of demonstrate the searchability of these born digital government publications and understand how methods like hashing or image retrieval might be valuable, but also because we uncover really sort of fascinating things. Like one example of this is that the 40 slide version that Colin Powell actually gave at the UN Security Council is not the version that the State Department put on their website in 2003 as the official PowerPoint. They actually put up a 7-slide modified version, which looked more sort of PowerPoint-like. So if you see in this slide below, the initial sort of slide within a slide was what appeared in the slide deck. And then the state.gov sort of made it look more like a PowerPoint and added all this additional text and then purported that to be the official version of the PowerPoint that was presented. So again, I think it speaks to these ways in which PowerPoints have become really important in born digital context as well, but also we see it as a case study for examining specific artifacts in this context. In terms of next steps for this work in a really sort of concrete way, I'm trying to build out a proper UI using CDX metadata for metadata faceting and incorporating keyword search. I'm sharing with colleagues for feedback. So if any of you are interested in talking about this further, I'd love to do so. But also scaling up toward all the 2008 end of term PDFs, then to mixed file types and more broadly LC Web Archive holdings. And also working with scholars across disciplines to make sense of these .gov materials and answering domain-specific questions in new ways. So I'm going to start to zoom out here as we get toward questions and point to what I see as the important directions as we move toward publicly deployed search systems in the context of web archives. And so here, building out collaborations are essential. Alma seems to be a fantastic place to think about this. Conducting ethnographic research to understand the needs, sensitivities, and limitations around web archives. And then, of course, all these kinds of machine learning affordances that are emerging from human AI interaction, multimodal machine learning, ML operations, and data storage. And lastly, foregrounding an ethically informed approach where we can draw on critical data studies, critical archival studies, and beyond. In terms of zooming out most broadly here toward a horizon of work in computing cultural heritage, again, it's been really exciting to see so many people at various institutions, universities, and labs undertaking this work. And so I think there are a few directions that I see as really important to continuing this body of work collectively. The first is that really navigating and making sense of this work of cultural heritage presents distinctly interdisciplinary challenges and why an iSchool is such an important place to be doing this work. That developing new approaches in library and information science, machine learning, and digital humanities in order to accomplish this is essential. And lastly, if we ought to have this work be successful, we must foreground ethical stewardship of both born digital and digitized materials at all sorts of different scales. I'm going to end here with a couple of shameless plugs. Of course, I'm starting my lab here in the iSchool, which I'm incredibly excited about, which I'll call the Lab for Computing Cultural Heritage. This is, of course, an open invitation to everyone that I'd love to talk about collaborations, projects with all of you, with students and beyond. And so I see this as the beginnings of those discussions that I'm really excited to have in person on campus here in a few months. And then also with my colleagues, Jim Casey, Joshua Ortiz-Baco, and Sarah Salter, we just had a call go out for a new debates in DH volume that we're co-editing called Cultures of Scale, Data, Disciplines, and Labor, where we're actually situating this volume both, of course, in the digital humanities, but also with an orientation toward libraries, archives, and museums, and how these kinds of interdisciplinary questions of scale emerge and how we might begin to complicate them. So also, if this is something that any of you are interested in contributing to, please feel free to reach out and would love to have a conversation. I think our abstracts are due in a month. But with that, I will acknowledge everyone who's made this work possible at the Library of Congress, people at the Kluge Center, the web archiving team, digital content management, and LC Labs. Of course, everyone here at the iSchool, and then a number of external collaborators. And with that, I will turn to questions. So thank you so much and excited to talk more here.
Thank you so much. That was very fascinating and so much to consider. So I will open it up to the room and online for questions.
Who's gonna?
Okay, Amy, I see Amy's.
I know there's online too, so you can quite see. Thanks so much, Ben. I was really fascinated by just sitting squarely between all of these challenging questions about archiving, preservation, and data, but all of the technical questions too. So I'm going to try to answer questions like right in the middle between those two. It seems like a lot of the work you've done so far really leverages this stable media, things like newspaper layouts that you have some unambiguous shot on, aside from all of the data quality issues and image quality issues, or a PDF that is a relatively stable way of rendering text and images and shapes and colors. But it strikes me like you didn't talk about things like HTML and the web. And that in particular is not particularly stable. Like there's not one way to render it. It can get rendered in lots of different ways. It's not particularly semantic, so you can't always know what content relates to what. Browsers change how they render it over time, and so it depends on like, well, were you looking at this in Internet Explorer in 1997, or are you looking at it in a modern browser? It could look completely different. I'm curious how you think about that particular shift in media and all of its complexities, and how that might complicate a lot of the techniques that you've worked on to try to build scalable extraction and mining techniques.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you so much for the question, Amy. I think it's like one that I continue to really think about. And, I think in some sense, starting with the PDFs has been my way of scaling up while also giving myself some space to explore what precisely this means, because I think it is a really complex question and one that I don't think I have the full clarity on myself yet. In some sense, I think the sort of unstructured nature of the web and these mixed file types, whether we're looking at sort of HTML to, even some of the weirder stuff like random audio files hanging off of the state.gov or something like that, are like remarkably challenging in terms of how we make them searchable. On the other hand, I actually see it as a really interesting opportunity to certainly there are questions about what's stable, how one renders this, even thinking about different browsers over time or what one's screen size looks like has a profound impact on this. But I also think there's sort of another layer of searching that I've seen some work beginning to gesture at, but I think is largely space for a lot of concrete or more sort of directed work too, is how we actually begin to do search against like HTML directly, and how we can sort of not just understand the evolution of sort of the content within the structure, but understanding the evolution of the structure itself, I think is really fascinating. And also, I think a lot of questions in my mind about how the instability or the different ways in which this is rendered might actually sort of lend itself to conversations that are occurring around the construction of these like multimodal data sets that we see using to train these machine learning models, where it seems like in some sense the data quality is just lower because of these unstructured reasons and everything too. And so I sort of see this fitting into a broader conversation around sort of how we make these associations between the images and the text and the broader structure as one that seems like really, really challenging. And again, I think I might to a certain extent just be restating what you've already said so well, but I see it as something I'm excited to continue to probe and to actually like get get some hands-on work with as I start working with the broader work files themselves.
Thanks, appreciate that.
Yeah, I can have a follow-up question to that. Ben, thanks. This was great. My name is Richard Lewis. I'm Associate Dean of Libraries at Bothell campus. And especially the PALS PowerPoint, really for me, looking at a web archive and what your discussion around that, the original PowerPoint versus the state's, 7 images of PowerPoint, making it into a PowerPoint when it wasn't really. Who controls the narrative when it's in a web archive? Who's controlling the metadata behind it, or kind of the descriptors? The story. There's so much story. It's not this with a web crawler scraping. It kind of might give a semblance of neutrality to it, like, oh, this is just the way it was, but it's being manipulated in different ways. I guess how are you approaching that? Or are you approaching that at all?
Thank you. Yes, very nice to meet you as well. And yeah, thank you for the question. I'm glad that sort of specific portion resonated with you and is sort of some work that I've been really excited to be a part of and continue to grow in terms of how we study these specific artifacts. Yeah, definitely. I think there's, one of the interesting things about moving toward web archives is hearing various people's perspectives, specifically people who, work on web archives professionally, sort of full time, is that in many senses, they're just an entirely different kind of orientation toward cultural heritage, in the sense that like you said, there's sort of this notion maybe of just having crawlers go through and do this in an automated way. And in many senses, like even the work, and when I say that, I mean WARC files, the sort of broader containers that web archives are stored in, are not stored in any sort of coherent way in the sense that, right, you might have a finding aid where different folders convey some semantic similarity in the folder, right? Whether it's sort of materials that were correspondences with between two specific people, or edited versions of a specific drafts of a specific book. In the web archive, you just get a dump in this work file purely based on what was scraped at any given time, and there's not even any sort of coherence beyond just the URL stamp of the timestamp of the crawl. So I think it speaks to the ways in which understanding how these materials are being aggregated, how to even organize them at a basic level, are really sort of like existentially challenging in a way that I think is uncomfortable for a lot of people, including myself. It's just a very specific or a different way of looking at the materials. I also think your point is a very important one, that just because we have a crawl of the .gov site doesn't mean that the .gov, what's appearing there hasn't been manipulated in some way, and that it's easy to conflate the two. And so what I see as an exciting direction for some of this work, and something that I want to directly do with the Powell PowerPoint, or as Trevor calls it, the Powell point, which I think is great, is trying to develop methods for actually sort of not just taking a hash of the PDF and seeing where else the hash is appearing, but developing these kinds of image recognition techniques where we can take various slides and see where the slides are appearing in other kinds of .gov materials, and understanding sort of the genealogy or the evolution of the digital artifacts embedded within the PowerPoint. And I wonder if that's another way of getting at your question about how we can reconstruct these kinds of questions of mediation or alteration that might not appear at the very sort of initial level in the CDX file of seeing the timestamps of the crawls and what's there underneath.
Thanks.
I saw that Melanie posted a question to chat, so I thought I'd read it for the room too. She said that you gestured towards this at the end, but I'm wondering if at all the public explosion of AI models has impacted the work you're doing or the work that the cultural heritage institutions are interested in. For example, is the Library of Congress or other cultural heritage institutions more or less open to incorporating machine learning / AI approaches?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Melanie. I mean, this is one that's definitely been on the top of my mind, and I'm sure for you as well. Interestingly, speaking, this is really, really anecdotally, but about the question at the Library of Congress in particular, AI has been sort of situated in a both, I think, in a complicated way here in the internal discussions. And so a number of months ago, the Library of Congress participated in a Senate and House hearing related to AI and its uses in legislative branch agencies. And so there's been more attention on the use of AI at the library than ever before. And so the library actually just rolled out a policy a couple of months ago surrounding uses of generative AI. And there's essentially a restriction now on site that unless a project has been formally documented as an experiment, which is run through labs and OCIO and a couple other divisions in the library, you're not allowed to use generative AI in your work. I think here on site, it's been really interesting from the perspective, given that like the Copyright Office is located directly as part of the Library of Congress, so there are particular sensitivities around copyright. But I also think it's been interesting at a sort of couple of perspectives, and sorry if this is a long-winded response, but on the one hand, it definitely feels maybe perhaps limiting in the sense that it's harder to get a project up and running sort of at these various divisions and just go for it, right? Like doing some experiments with GPT around web archives, the team needs more approval. The flip side of it is that they've actually standardized procedures under which a project can start utilizing these methodologies, and it involves using internally developed like risk assessment sheets and worksheets that have been produced toward responsible use cases and articulating dimensions of the project. And so I've actually seen it to be an interesting response where perhaps there is a nice middle ground of maybe some more oversight and more attention on what it means to use generative AI in particular in these larger models, but also being sort of principled about documenting it from the beginning. I've also noticed, and this is maybe just in conversations with people, sort of informally, not just at the LC, but more broadly, it seems like a lot of questions around sort of data openness and what that means, recognizing that the position that cultural heritage institutions have is often one of producing open data, making it available for all the reasons that we all believe to be very important, but then in the hands of some of these other companies that are utilizing it for purposes that we might view as a little bit more suspect or complicated, presents a lot of really, I think, multi-layered challenges. And so I'm actually really curious to see where the conversation goes around open collections, public domain materials, digitization, and how cultural heritage institutions sort of are able to continue that mission while also not feeling like then they're doing free labor for some of these companies that will then vacuum up the data without the sort of reciprocal exchange that we might all think is really valuable when typically doing this. So I think from my work and everything too, I see it as an ongoing conversation and one that has clearly been moving at a very rapid pace that I find myself trying to keep up with. Was the new model like Llama 3, I think just came out today from Meta, and that's been an explosion on Twitter and everything too. So keeping pace has been its own set of challenges. But also I think an opportunity to see cultural heritage institutions and LAMs in particular as a really meaningful place to go about this in a principled way, given the sort of shared set of values that we all have. In that part, I really find a lot of hope in.
Well, good. Ben, can I squeak in a question?
Of course.
It's great to hear the directions you're going, and it's great to have you here. So as you know, I've always been sort of worried about and thinking about the potential for loss in really big aggregated collections, what we can lose along the way, but also how we continue to surface the really valuable, distinct, and often small things that might sit within. So when you started talking about the curatorial prospects and even just thinking about the redacted content and what you could do with that as a sub-collection, for instance, is there interest in LC for that kind of enrichment and surfacing of things within the collections there? Are they investing in that at all, or have any interest in that going in that direction?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for the question, Carol. I would say in conversations with staff, it seems like there is an interest insofar as it just feels like specifically with the web archives, unless one's doing a very targeted collection of, one specific subdomain where it's clear what the impact is, more broadly, it's some of these like the level of .gov and everything too. Finding any way to get one's head around what's even there seems valuable, and it just feels like looking through a CDEX file and just looking at the URLs isn't going to be sufficient. So in that sense, I think I've seen quite a bit of sort of interest or opportunities to try to explore these methods just as an exploratory mechanism, if that makes sense. Like not even necessarily to definitively produce like the sub-collection, but rather just to go through the process of figuring out ways of exploring what even is there, just given that they're just, these massive files sitting in AWS or S3 buckets with no real way to navigate. So I think that's sort of what I was trying to get at with some of this. And again, I think per like everything you were saying too, in terms of not losing the specificity of smaller collections or also understanding what's lost with these bigger approaches remains something I'm really invested in. And I see these kinds of approaches as hopefully not being sort of like the only one or the predominant one, but rather one in sort of a broader toolbox, one tool in a broader toolbox for going about how we navigate these. But I am legitimately very curious to see what happens here in particular as the policy around some of these models in generative AI continues to unfold, and then also how that intersects with the questions of what the web archiving service unit is working on and how they can begin to provide access as well.
Great. Thanks, Ben.
Of course.
Well, I think we managed to just run right through that hour. So thank you, Ben, once again. I think, and thank you for all of the putting it out there for interested in collaboration and continued conversation and connection to the CALMA Center too. So lots of threads for us to pull on as when you come on board this summer. So thanks everybody for coming by, and I'm going to end the recording and end the show. So thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you all. Nice to see you.
Someone never done